Our story begins. Once upon a time, the philosopher John Locke described human life with the following glowing terms: nasty, brutish, and short. I believe he can be forgiven his optimism. Locke was thinking about his unpleasant political thoughts back in the 17th century, a time when the average human life was about 35 years long. Moreover, the average human lifespan had been 35 years for some time. And by some time, I mean since at least the time of Sargon the Great, some 2,500 years before the birth of Jesus. And some scholars push that particular life expectancy number back much farther, suggesting that 35 was probably the high side of average as far back as 10,000 years before the Common Era. 35 years. I remember thinking once upon a time that 35 was quite old. I have been told by my children that this intuition is still correct. That isn't to say that all people throughout history spontaneously went on to glory at their 35th birthday as if they were extras in the 1976 film Logan's Run. John Locke himself lived to 72 years old. Socrates was 71. Buddha was 80. Methuselah was 969. Elrond of Rivendell was 6,500 years old when he sent Frodo and the Fellowship to Mount Doom. Some of you here today think that immortality is a fine objective when talking about lifespan. Some of you. I'm reminded of a quote by Woody Allen, though. I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality through not dying. I don't want to live on in the hearts of my countrymen. I want to live on in my apartment. Personally, I subscribe to this sentiment. It wasn't until recently that human lifespans started stumbling towards the infinite, and I'm convinced that this progress had a lot to do with doctors discovering that vigorous hand washing between surgeries had a positive impact on health outcomes. Yeah. Penicillin, for the record, was discovered only 50 years later. And that was 1926. And that wasn't widely available until World War II. And data shows pretty clearly that this is when things really took off. Today, the average human lives to be about 75. A bit less for men, a bit more for women, a whole lot more for the wealthy, and yes, for the record, all of you here today qualify as wealthy. Yeah. Even though the Lotto Fairy has not answered my call, yeah, that's fair enough. Over dinner the other night, my family and I were talking about why it is that women live longer than men. If you've never Googled this, I recommend it. After you scroll past the pages and pages of videos that showcase a stunning lack of common sense among men at both work and play, you will also find that there has been quite a bit of science that's been done on this question, exploring the relationship between estrogen and heart disease, for example. This science is interesting, but the videos are gold. Oh my God, they're really funny, but I digress. During one semi-random Google session, I learned that there does not seem to be anything biologically necessary about dying at 75. In theory, that number could be quite a bit higher than it currently is. The fact that our bodies wear out like old socks seems to be something we might be able to slow down. Perhaps one day slow down dramatically. Who knows? But this fascination that we have with longevity is not new. Humans have been thinking about this forever, in part because the line between life and death has been close for the vast majority of our history. Plague, famine, war, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tidal waves, wildfires, dirty hands. All of that meant that individual life was constantly lived on the edge of a knife. And trying to make sense of this, trying to see the rightness, the justice of this, inspired a lot of different reactions. In the Mediterranean West, Christianity was literally founded on the single idea that death was not the end. But if not the end, what happened next? So going back a tad bit farther, we find in Scripture the Hebrew concept of Sheol. Anybody heard that word before, Sheol? A couple of you. It's the place of shadows. And Greek myths talk about something quite similar, a sad place within the cosmic realm of Hades where all spirits go, a place of dull, endless colorlessness. To say that this is unsatisfying would be a rather significant understatement. The introduction of a more technicolor afterlife was probably inevitable, and one filled with endless food and sex and games set among rolling green hills, crisscrossed with rivers of wine where celestial music filled the air. That was different. And the mystery cults of Isis, Demeter, Dionysus, Mithras, and others promised exactly this. But that paradise was secret knowledge. Access was limited to the dedicated few. These cults were very popular during the Greek and Roman occupation of the Middle East. Later Christian and Islamic writers, one could argue, were deeply inspired by those stories. Now, in the East, Vedanta Hinduism taught about the afterlife a bit differently. Namely, that the afterlife looked a lot like regular life, because that's exactly what it was. You were born, you lived, you died, you were reborn. An endless cycle, literally endless. In Vedanta, the world had no beginning and no end, and you were going to live the whole of it. If that sounds pretty great, it kind of does. Remember that the average lifespan was, again, and I'm quoting, nasty, brutish, and short. So perhaps you could forgive Siddhartha Gautama for wanting a bit more than endless human suffering. His contribution was novel. You should break the cycle entirely. A successful life would lead to no rebirth, and therefore no suffering. Failing that perfection, well, a correctly practicing Buddhist could trust that the next life would be at least better than the last. Now, a few hundred years after Buddha's death, Pure Land Buddhists went a slightly different direction and introduced a familiar Western vision of heaven into the growing varieties of Buddhist experience. Yet another variation came about 1,000 years after that, when the Buddhist mystic Santideva suggested that rebirth could actually be shaped, that you could be reborn with purpose. So instead of trying to escape the wheel, you should choose to remain and dedicate yourself to leading others towards enlightenment and escape. None of us are saved until all of us are saved. And we call these brave souls the Bodhisattva. If you've ever joined our Sunday evening meditation group, you may have even learned the Bodhisattva vows. I will confess, I appreciate the agency here, the choice to become a Time Lord, a warrior for progress across all of history. It sounds pretty awesome. And stepping back, I'm also going to confess that I appreciate the idea of cosmic balance. If life on Earth is so short and history is so long, then no matter how great a human life might be, we are all still getting the short end of the stick, one could argue. To balance out the brevity of the now, the suffering of the now, the injustice of the now, I completely understand the appeal of any promise of a later reward, perfection, purpose, or even bliss. Back here in the West, that bliss has been described a lot of different ways. And as I mentioned, the early Christian writings look like they were stolen from Greek cultists. But at some point, they got scrubbed of all the fun, organic stuff. We got less banquets and more harps. Later still, the idea of heaven became quite abstract. Heaven meant being eternally transfixed by the glory of God, or perhaps it meant a final coming home, the reunification, the ultimate reunification with the source and ground of all being. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure what that means, but it sounds pretty good. Not eternally feasting in the halls of Valhalla good, but it's not a kick in the pants either. Now, I will offer that there has been quite a bit more clarification about the other side of the afterlife, the not-so-blissful part. Lots and lots of detail about what happens if you're not lucky enough to earn your wings and your harp. Dante's famous Inferno provides one of the most robust explorations ever of hell, punishment, the wrath of God, and those creatures that deliver God's judgment on the souls of the lost, the forsaken, the evil, the rule breakers, and those who do not wash their hands. But Dante's not the only one, hardly. We Westerners have been absolutely obsessed with words about hell, and we have been entertaining ourselves for centuries by generating metric tons of bloody and lurid prose. This chilly October season, it strikes me that our puritanical obsession with scaring ourselves silly is something we Americans still delight in, even when hell no longer takes center stage. Throughout the 19th century, though, I should note that our Unitarian ancestors did not abandon hell. To be fair, they didn't really talk about it much either. Their primary beef was the non-divinity of Jesus, and honestly, that was heresy enough. Rather, it was our Universalist ancestors who had something to say, and they said the most scandalous things. They said that if eternal punishment was true, then God was a sadist. Obviously, God was not a sadist, therefore something was rotten in the state of modern Christianity. For the record, their arguments were not just subversive, they were terrifically persuasive. And by the end of the 19th century, most mainline Christian denominations, at least here in the United States, had stopped with all of the hell talk. Yay for us. Now, the question of what did happen after death, though, took a turn for the weird in the 19th century. That weird had a name: spiritualism. As you may recall from previous episodes of Reverend Scot in the Pulpit, spiritualism was the belief that after death, human awareness persists. More, it may be contacted by the living. This belief and the practices of accomplishing this contact became very popular and quite widespread after the vast tragedies of the Civil War and World War I. As you may recall, both Unitarians and Universalists played large and central roles in the history of the spiritualist movement, just as humanists played a large and central role in debunking claims of individual spiritualists. We are really wrapped around this particular one. But it is right at this point in our history that I'd like to pause and feel the tension between these better angels of our UU ancestry, between wanting to believe in something greater and the need to justify that belief. As we moved from the age of belief into the age of reason, the practice of science evolved and grew, even if we practitioners did not. And that's where Mary Roach enters my story. Some of you may know Mary Roach. Anybody read any of her work? More of you should do this. It's good. She's been called America's funniest science writer, which I will suggest ought to be a goal that more of us should aspire to. She's the author of 7 New York Times bestsellers and her 2005 book, 6 Feet Over, which I stole the title for this sermon from. The subtitle of that book is Science Tackles the Afterlife. In it, she brings her scientific background to the question of what happens after we die. She started her quest in India, alongside researchers attempting to document reincarnation. She went on from there to review the history of scientific attempts to locate the soul within the human body. The pineal gland was one notable example, handed to us from René Descartes. She recounts how some people tried to weigh the soul, that famously unrepeatable turn of the 20th century experiment that 1 century after that gave us the movie 21 Grams. Anybody heard of that one? 21 Grams, the weight of the soul? Then there was the discovery of X-rays and what that brought to the search of the soul. And I think we could all benefit by skipping the entire revolting era of ectoplasm. But spiritual recordings, psychoacoustics, ghost hunters, psychedelics, near-death experiences, all of that is pretty amazing stuff. Good read. Even if in practice it may be just a bit short of convincing. Look, for those of you that are inclined to seek this book out, I won't spoil it, but I do heartily recommend it. And I plan to read more of her work in the future, so stay tuned for that. But I will offer this. What I found in Mary Roach's stories was a deep and common human longing, a longing to know. She traced out this long thread of the desperately curious, those that used whatever tools science had to offer in search of answers to a question that has haunted humans from the very beginning of our humanity. To meet the question mark that has challenged us since we first came to grips with the fact that at some point we all must leave. Is death really the end? Or is there something more? A bit over 100 years ago, several of our faith ancestors collectively shrugged their shoulders. These so-called social gospelers said that whatever it is that comes after. The promise, whatever it might be, must never distract you from what comes now. More, that you must understand that what is yours, and yours to change, to hopefully, faithfully change for the better. And I will confess that this is my current stance. Just as I will confess that while I don't know what comes hereafter, I have a pretty good idea of what comes today. And I believe that the arc of history will only bend towards progress with the help of your human hearts and your human hands. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But like the poster that hangs over Fox Mulder's desk in the X-Files, I want to believe. And this Halloween season, when the veils between the worlds of the living and the dead are said to be at their thinnest, I find myself wondering, what lies ahead for me? What more, if anything, there might be? I think about my mother, my relatives, the great cloud of witnesses and ancestors that have gone before me, gone before all of us. I wonder where they are. I hope they are content. And if nothing else, I hope that one day, in the hopefully infinitely distant future, I will be content too. My friends, I don't have answers. I only have questions. And this question of what happens next, it haunts me. But for now, I'll give the final words to Mary Roach, who, after spending a year pushing against the edges of scientific understanding, had this to say, quote, "Has my year among the evidence gatherers left me believing in anything I didn't believe in a year ago? It has. I believe that not everything we humans encounter in our lives can be neatly and convincingly tucked away inside the orderly cabinetry of science. Certainly most things can, including the vast majority of what people ascribe to fate, ghosts, ESP, Jupiter rising. Most, but not all. I believe in the possibility of something more. It's not much, but it's more than I believed a year ago. And perhaps I should believe in a hereafter, in a consciousness that zips through the air like a Simpsons rerun, simply because it's more appealing and more hopeful than not believing. The debunkers are probably right, but they're no fun to visit a graveyard with. Amen.
Visit us at uusg.org.